Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Syrian civil war has entered its 9th year, and this time, after many foiled attempts, it seems that the end is in sight. To analyze the latest developments, we're joined here in the studio by Dr. Jonathan Spire, who is a fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Colonel in Reserve, Miri Eisin, who is a fellow at the ICT at IDC Herzliya. Welcome. Yeah. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding on the latest developments pertaining to the Syria front.
So indeed, as you have just stated, the Syrian civil war, which started in early 2011, is up there with the longest and worst of civil wars. It has been going on now much longer than the American Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, and even the Lebanese Civil War, which seemed to have held the record. Now, perhaps it is also a war of attrition, because all of the parties involved, or most of them, are probably tired of what has been going on, and there are only some pockets of resistance left, along with the various roads to peace or to some national reconciliation. So we have Idlib, we have the Turkish Syrian border, we have in the south the Tanef area, we have, of course, the Israeli-Iranian confrontation over Golan, and the remnants of the ISIS, of Daesh, which are being eradicated as we speak. So perhaps it is true that the impression that the war is winding down will this time come true.
Dr. Spire, you've visited Syria on several occasions during this conflict. You have seen both sides of the equation, also joining the Kurdish militias in north and northeast of Syria, as well as visiting the Assad regime in Damascus. How would you look at the current situation pertaining to the declaration on both sides that the war is indeed at its final stages?
Yeah, I do have the sense, I agree with Amir, that there is a sense of winding down. And if you check the casualty figures, it confirms that. That's to say, the last month, for example, was the lowest number of people killed in the Syrian war since it had begun. And the reason for that, at least for now, we have to be careful, I think, with predictions regarding Syria. But at least for now, there is a sense that the kind of de facto lines of control between the various enclaves are to some degree solidifying. Currently, the Assad regime controls around 60% of the country. You have around 30%, just under 30% in the hands of the Kurdish-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces, that's Syria east of the Euphrates, and then a remaining 10%, as was mentioned before, in the northwest of the country, Idlib province, and then to the north, Afrin, the former Kurdish canton of Afrin, controlled by the Turks, and what is left of the Sunni Arab rebellion that was declared in early 2011, which now more or less works exclusively for the Republic of Turkey. What's left of the rebellion, I think, is probably best characterized today as military contractors working for the Republic of Turkey and President Erdogan. Now, there's a sense right now that things look like those de facto lines of division are going to last for a while. Assad would like very much to head east of the Euphrates, but as long as America wants to stay, and at least as of today, it appears America is intending to leave 400 troops east of the Euphrates, or 200 east of the Euphrates, 200 in El Tanef. As long as they are there, the regime can't come east of the Euphrates. Assad would like to roll into Idlib also, but as long as he doesn't have Russian permission to do that, and as of now he does not have Russian permission to do that, that enclave is likely to survive as well. So right now there's a sense of slowly solidifying lines of control, and that is, I think, the way in which these things tend to end, not with a bang, so to speak, but more with a whimper.
Definitely, and there are plenty of developments to discuss during today's program pertaining to those solidifying lines. Colonel Eisin, when we're talking about the world's perception of the current situation, we see more and more embassies and diplomatic missions opening, both from Western countries and from Arab and Muslim countries that were on the opposing side of the Assad regime, supporting the rebels, battling President Bashar al-Assad and his demands to continue to control this country. To what degree do you think that there is an ongoing opening for Assad to yet again reassert his position as the leader of the Syrian Arab Republic within the international community?
I think there's no question whatsoever that within the Middle East Everybody wants to stabilize Syria. Right now, the one who's going to stabilize Syria, that's not necessarily good for the Syrian people, but to stabilize Syria is Bashar Assad. The different countries around want that stabilization. They don't want to have the chaos that they've had there over the last 7-8 years, which has spilled into every other country around. As all of the countries were supplying not troops, but their own citizens were all fighting within that Syrian arena, they want to see that stabilizing factor, and part of that is having diplomatic ties, is opening it up. Second aspect is the new drawn lines within the Middle East immediately impact in an outer system. We all know of Russia's involvement. Russia is there. So when you're looking at the outer lines right now, stabilizing of Syria, the relationships with Russia, the relationship with Iran and Turkey, keep going from there. Where is the United States? How is Europe going to step in? I'm looking at a sort of, it's not mundane for them, but the aspect of who's going to rebuild Syria. There's a contract on the line. That's already economy. I'm going to go see China step in there. So you certainly have the opening of the door because of the stabilization. Now we're getting into realpolitik. Let's get into not business as usual, but back to business.
Mr. Oren, after President Donald Trump announced immediate withdrawal of U.S. forces, of course, he has shifted that decision. As Dr. Spire has also mentioned, there are going to remain two groups of 200 forces, American forces in east of the Euphrates and the other in El Tanef, something that comes from what we hear from Trump's national security advisor, due to the fact that Iran is still there, and wherever the Islamic State is ousted, the Iranians are entering and emerging as the victors of this entire conflict. To what degree now that the Russians, after a meeting between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Russian President Vladimir Putin, came to an arrangement of establishing somewhat of a joint task force, it's more of a multilateral task force, in order to remove foreign troops, as they stated, from Syria, will the removal of Iranian forces, if indeed it's possible, bring about the end of American presence in Syria?
President Trump has a very creative way of running his administration. Announcements first, staff work later. And what happened was that last December, when he announced quite abruptly following a conversation on the phone with Turkish President Erdogan, that he is pulling out everyone, and of course it was timed around Christmas time in order to have some good feeling at home. Only later did the Department of Defense and the Department of State and the intelligence community start to work on the details. And apparently they have managed to convince him that they can't find a suitable solution by having paramilitary advisors from the Central Intelligence Agency or contractors or some other alternative, that at least 200 uniformed personnel must be stationed there in the Euphrates area, along with the other 200 in Tanef, and Tanef is Jordan, Iraq, Israel. This is not the Turkey-Syria problem. And apparently he has gone along, and he has also slowed down the pace of the withdrawal from immediately doing it to some 4 or perhaps 6 months. However, if President Trump can reach some grand deal with his counterpart, President Putin, which may not be domestically possible now in the situation in the United States over the last 2 years, the Russia inquiry and all of that, he will probably try to get some bigger deal, including the Ukraine and perhaps even Iran, the nuclear deal, which Russia is sticking to, while Trump has already pulled out of. But it doesn't seem as if pulling out the American troops has a lot to do with the Iranian forces there, except as a pretext. Because obviously part of the formula which is going to end the war will be the removal of foreign forces. So this could be a cover. If the Americans are leaving, so are the Iranians, but it doesn't mean that the Turks are leaving too, or the Russians. The Russians are going to stay as the guests of the Syrian government. In any event, Israel is going to insist on fighting the Iranians at will. And the Putin-Netanyahu meeting probably had to do with the past rather than with the future, with the September incident in which the Ilyushin spy plane was down by the Syrian defense, and because Israel is approaching an election, none of these meetings, including next week, when Secretary of State Pompeo visits Lebanon and Israel. These are two countries he has ignored over the last time. During the last visit to the area, it doesn't seem realistic to expect anything to come out of it.
Dr. Spire, do you agree with this understanding of the current situation? And, of course, during John Bolton's visit to the region, he visited both Israel to try and reassure the Israelis about the Iranian presence in Syria, as well as visited Turkey to try and emphasize to the Turks that America is not going to abandon this time around the Kurdish militias that it backed in order to eradicate the Islamic State in Syria.
Yeah, I do very much agree with the characterization of the policy-making process in the U.S. administration, which is kind of fascinating to observe because it's kind of an original way of doing business and it's a bit new to all of us. They clearly have walked back the December 19th declaration, and the Americans are sticking around for now. My sense is that, again, that foreign forces are going to be in Syria for quite some time to come. I mean, we're only right at the very, very beginning, if at all, of a meaningful diplomatic process to bring the war to an end. And my sense is that, as I kind of said before, that the war is more likely to end by kind of shuddering to a halt, so to speak, and because of fatigue and exhaustion, rather than a really properly worked out diplomatic process. And in that context, what it means is that a whole bunch of the new conflicts that have sort of spilled onto Syrian soil in the course of the last 7 years are likely to remain on Syrian soil. The Turkish-Kurdish conflict has spilled into Syrian soil, and it's going to stay there. The Israeli-Iranian conflict similarly. And I would say that's the reason for that primarily is because, contrary, I think, to some of the very optimistic statements made by some Israeli policymakers over the last month or so, the Iranian project in Syria is multifaceted and deep-rooted. It's not just about bases close to the Quneitra crossing. It's not just about sort of guerrilla forces close to the border. It's a very deep process which takes in also Shia militias working for the Iranians who are on Syrian soil, but also homegrown Syrian Hezbollah, as we like to call them, Syrian Hezbollah-type forces, Quwat al-Ridda and others we could name, which consist of Syrian citizens recruited into militia structures that work for the Iranians. Those aren't going anywhere because those are not really foreign forces anymore, as the Iranians will claim during any diplomatic process. And similarly, even forces such as the National Defense Forces, Jaish al-Sha'bi, who are actually part of the official Syrian state security forces, but which are nevertheless created by the Iranians and answer to Iranian orders. So it's a very deep-rooted process, taking in also, by the way, land purchases, also even attempts to recruit, with not a great deal of success, Syrian support for the Iranian ideology and style of government. So it's a very deep and broad process. That process isn't going anywhere, and it's going to stay on Iranian soil, and on Syrian soil, and therefore Israeli attempts to uproot it and to prevent its further entrenchment are likely to be part of the picture in Syria also going forward.
Indeed. Colonel Eisin, your take on it?
So I'm interested and fascinated by the way that we look at the U.S. aspect, because as far as I'm concerned, the 200 or 400 to here or there are so unimportant. It's about the fact that the United States has not been in the Syrian conflict pretty much from the beginning. So it isn't a change right now that they're suddenly going to be getting out. Russia is on the ground. Iran is on the ground. And the aspect is, what is the U.S. policy towards that, not towards the 400 troops that are helping out the Kurds. I'm not underestimating this issue of the Syrian Kurds, but I don't see it as the U.S. administration being there and backing them. I think that there are clear choices on the table. Is the United States of America going to choose Turkey or Kurdistan? That's a whole different question. If they choose Turkey, then they're going to leave the Kurds. If they choose Kurdistan, then they're going to have a whole big issue with the Turks. So that's a different question altogether. I think that the Russian issue is, for the Russians, I'm worried about the fact that Israel is becoming the conduit through the Iranian-Israeli confrontation, that Israel is becoming, for the Russians, a conduit to get messages over to the United States, that we're going to see Russian actions that actually have to do with their wanting to use Israel to impact U.S.-Russian relations. So in that sense, as I like to say, what happened in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. It hasn't been like that for the last 8 years. I don't like calling it a civil war at all because it was so many additional aspects than just a civil war. It wasn't just between Syrians. So many other things were going on, and that's spilling over now. We're into the aftermath.
Mr. Oren,
But this was also the case in the American Civil War when you had French and Poles and Germans. In the Spanish Civil War, of course.
well, history always repeats itself. The question is, though, the waiver of the Iranian nuclear deal to several countries, including Turkey, is about to expire. Will the Turks try and use this as a leverage in order to try and pull the Americans to their side over the Kurds in Syria?
They probably would, when we are going to see it very soon. The Syrian Minister of Defense and the Syrian Chief of Staff have been meeting with the heads of the Pentagon, the acting Secretary of Defense, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They probably also dealt with those political issues. And just to add to what the Miri just said,
Please.
The fact and the perception, which is also a fact, that America is going back home, is isolationist. This has had an impact on the Israeli public. And therefore you saw all of a sudden an exercise, an air defense exercise, hastily arranged between the Americans and the Israelis, with giant American cargo planes landing at an Israeli Air Force base, downloading missile batteries. This was in order to reassure the Israeli public that the Americans are not leaving, and also to reassure the Israeli elite that there is no need to preempt. There is no need to attack if Israel sees, for instance, an Iranian threat, a missile threat, because the Americans are going to keep their word, to cooperate with Israel in protecting the Israeli rear. So it had this double message.
Well, something that, of course, this reassurance can also lead to is a reassurance demanded by the Kurdish militias in northeastern Turkey. Of course, something that the Kurds are not planning on waiting for. They are already seeking to negotiate with the Assad regime and are doing so with Russian mediation, from what I hear.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that, Dr. Spahn?
Yeah, it's a complex process. I mean, as you're aware, Ilham Ahmed, one of the top officials of the Kurdish de facto authority east of the Euphrates, was just in Washington with a delegation just a couple of weeks ago. And the case that I met with them whilst they were there, and the case which they were busy trying to make in Washington to the Americans was, in a way, the only case they could make, which was that the war against ISIS is not over, that there's another phase to come of it, and that therefore the United States should stick around. Now, contrary to what we were all thinking then, it appears that somebody was listening, or at least something was going on behind the scenes, and it apparently means the Americans are now staying. Now, as a result of that, it means that the negotiations that opened between the Syrian Kurds and the regime in Damascus, which opened last July, have now been downgraded once more. Certainly contacts are continuing. It's worth noting that there have been contacts between the Assad regime and the de facto Syrian Kurdish Authority from the beginning of the war, or rather from the moment it emerged in 2012. This was never an entity that was at war with the regime. The rebellion was at war with the regime. The Kurds were trying to be in contact with everybody and stay out of it. So there is those contacts continuing. But as a result of the Americans apparently now deciding to stay, that's kind of reshuffled the cards once again. And the notion which many of us had just a few weeks ago, that the end game was coming, in which basically the Syrian Kurds, in order to avoid a Turkish invasion, which was their main fear, would have to pretty much unconditionally surrender to the return of the regime east of the Euphrates. That is no longer the picture. That has now changed.
Following up on the matter of the Turkish invasion, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has stated on several occasions that they didn't amass troops for no reason.
Right.
All those forces on the Syrian border are going to invade Syria at some point and defeat the offshoots, how they call them, of the PKK, the YPG and YPG. To what degree do you believe that they are going to move forward on this, or subsequently, is there a possibility of a shift where the Turks would direct their forces now towards Idlib to confront Ahrar al-Sham and the other organizations there?
I think that the Turks are going to have to keep their focus on the northwest. At the end of the day, the Turks are not free agents in Syria. The only reason why they were able to put a boot over the border into Afrin in January 2018 was because they had permission from Putin and the Russians to do so. That he's the landlord west of the Euphrates, so to speak. As of now, the landlord east of the Euphrates remains the United States of America. The notion of a Turkish invasion was sort of premised on the idea that the Americans were about to leave. Had they left in the original time frame that President Trump talked about, for sure the Turks, well, it's very, very likely the Turks would have moved in and tried to push this thing which everyone's been talking about, this 30-kilometer deep or 27-kilometer deep security zone they want to make along the border. But for as long as the Americans are there, again, I think the Turks are going to have to rethink this. I think they tried very hard to get American permission for this. They understand they now have to work with the Americans if they want to make this security zone happen. As of now, it doesn't look like they have American agreement for it.
One should recall that the PKK, the Kurdish organization, which is considered terrorist by most everyone in the world, was created with Syrian hospitality and with the intent of acting against Turkey under Abdullah Öcalan, its leader. This is not just a case of Syria finding itself a victim of an intruder. It was a cooperative effort between the Syrians under Hafez Assad and the Kurds.
So if I can just say on that sense that I don't give the Turks any kind of clean bill of health on this one. And let's be clear that over the last certainly 5 years, every time I saw Turkey say we're attacking ISIS, they were attacking the Kurds. So it's not, they use that extensively and that narrative, and they're very against the whole idea of the Kurds. And again, I'm not taking sides, but I think the entire world now has no choice.
Well, of course, the Syrian battle is also a battle over narratives, but I'd like to focus now on the joint task force again between Russia and Israel, which is a demand that was actually stated also in a joint statement between the Assad regime and the Kremlin, urging foreign forces to immediately be removed from Syria. Of course, a message directed towards the Trump administration and his forces over there, as they control, as also Dr. Spire mentioned earlier, 30% of the entire war-torn country. To what degree do you think that the Russians try to rally the Israelis in order to influence the Americans to remove them from Syria at the expense, of course, of the Iranians and others?
I think there's no question whatsoever that right now Russia is calling the shots a lot more than anybody else. Russia is the dominant strategic asset for them. Syria is a strategic asset for them to open the door to the U.S. The fact that they can impose, if they want to remove Iran, I believe that Russia is the only one that has the capability to tell the Iranians that they have to leave. That's not an easy confrontation, but at the end of the day, Iran is under sanctions, but we all kind of forget, so is Russia. So in that sense, again, I'm looking at Syria as a playground for Russia, which is harsh terms that they're using to try to remove the sanctions that they have themselves because of the Ukraine, because of other things that they've done over the last few years. So here we are right now. It's not about Syria. It's about sanctions on Russia. It's not about Syria. It's about Iran. And I think that the United States has an incredible challenge that when as I travel in and around, nobody in the United States of America right now is willing to engage with Russia. If you don't engage with Russia, you're not there. And it's not enough, I don't think, the 200 troops, the 400 troops. If you don't engage with Russia, then at the end, they're the ones who are dominant on that ground.
I'd like to hear Dr. Spire's take on that.
Well, my sense is that absolutely correct. And without any question, Russia is today the address through which you have to go if you want to get anything done on Syria. And that's true of Turkey, as I mentioned a moment ago. It's true of Israel also, in terms of Israel wanting Russia to induce the Iranians to leave, and so on and so forth. Undoubtedly, Russia is the central actor. My question would be, which I ask, would be, what is the interest of the Russians in inducing the Iranians to leave? And also, I think we have to ask, what is the capacity of the Russians? It's important to remember, successful that is, and decisive as it has been, the Russian intervention into Syria is relatively small scale, never more than around 30 aircraft at any one time, hardly any ground forces. The people who saved the Assad regime on the ground were the Iranians. It is the Iranians who created forces consisting of tens of thousands of fighting men that made the difference given Assad's chronic shortage of manpower. And those forces and those structures are still there. So I think we have to ask the question also of Russian will, of the Russian interest in asking them to leave, and also I think of the Russian ability. These things remain open questions in my mind.
Mr. Owen.
The fact that all of us here take for granted that the Russians are indeed almost helpless in inducing the Iranians to leave speaks to their success in tactically improving their positions, because they want to be perceived as very weak vis-a-vis the Iranians, and then during the end game coming out and forcing the Iranians to leave. But this is a very good card for them to say we can't do anything about it.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you the ability to state a closing statement. Colonel Eisin, we'll start with you.
I think that whenever we talk about the Syrian war, we tend to talk about Russia, the United States, Turkey, Bashar Assad. There's a country that has gone through horrific times, and part of the aftermath of this war is can you rebuild a country? We haven't talked about it this time, but I think that we also need to think about that aspect.
Dr. Spire?
Well, I think it's worth remembering that the center to President Hafez Assad's career was the intention, which he successfully achieved, to keep Syria united and to prevent Syria from becoming what geostrategically it kind of naturally tends to become, which is a playground for external forces. Hafez Assad, in a very cruel sometimes and very smart way, achieved that. His son, now nearly 2 decades into power, has decisively and I think conclusively lost that achievement. His rule has led to a situation today in which Syria is thoroughly penetrated by both regional and global forces, and that's not even though the wars are winding down, the rebel regime war and the ISIS coalition war, that situation is not going to end. That's the new reality of Syria.
Mr. Oren?
In general terms, what you should have in Syria following stabilization is export and import. Exporting the foreign forces and importing all the refugees and also the displaced persons inside Syria, a huge task. In Israeli terms, one should see what is happening in the election campaign, where the fate of the Golan Heights has already been talked about. The new rival to Prime Minister Netanyahu, former Chief of Staff Benny Gantz, has earlier this week visited the Golan along with his brothers in arms, now political colleagues, and stated that Israel will never go down from the Golan Heights. This may be the opening chord to what may happen after the elections, because the Russians will insist that Israel go back to the negotiating table.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Spire, Mr. Oren, and Colonel Eisin for being here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.